The United States Army entered World War I almost entirely unprepared for modern warfare. The role of the airplane of tanks and machine guns and gas shells had not been fully understood. Before they were encountered on the battlefield, the U.S. Army used French-supplied tanks and airplanes during the war, having none of their own. Eventually, nearly 3 million draftees swelled the American Army, which had been comprised of less than 100,000 men in 1916, all volunteers. When the war ended, almost 5 million Americans had served. They came home to victory parades and triumphant speeches, with most demanding their release from service as soon as possible. By 1920, the regular Army was reduced by law to less than 300,000 men. Through the decade, the Army declined as Congress failed to provide adequate funding to support its career officers, many of whom made their names on French soil. During the war, found little to do in the way of leading troopsmen such as George Patton Dwight. Eisenhower, George Marshall, Omar Bradley, and Douglas MacArthur sought to modernize the American Army, using the lessons learned in the Great War. Inadequate funds stymied them for most rank-and-file troops. Army life during the 1920s and 1930s was one of confinement to sleepy camps. An installation's pay was low, morale dwindled, out-of-date equipment mouldered, unused, gone with the trappings of patriotism, which decorated the troops of the late World War. Here is a view of life in the American military during the years between the World Wars, a time marked by Prohibition, the Great Depression, and rising isolationism in the United States. It was no way to get rich or young. Man choosing to enlist in the U.S. Army in 1920 did so for a period of either 1 or 3 years. In return, he received the rank of private and the promise of $21 per month for his services, about $348 today. Along with that generous compensation, he received his uniforms and equipment, housing, meals, health care, and training. He also found himself stripped of all outward appearances of individuality, dressing, walking, and behaving the same as his fellows. He learned these adjustments in appearance and behavior at the hands of a company sergeant. One, with several years of experience of Army life, the company sergeant determined which recruits were most likely to qualify as specialists, such as radio men or messengers. Such positions, after training and qualification, brought additional pay and opportunities for promotion. By the mid-1920s, the United States maintained 3 large overseas garrisons in the Panama Canal Zone, the Philippines, and the territory of Hawaii. Another small garrison was in China. The rest of the Army, of about 250,000 men, was scattered in posts across the country in undermanned bases and camps. Though the Army attempted to close many such camps and consolidate its troops to improve training, Congress stood in the way. Individual congressmen recognized the financial benefit of Army bases to their constituents. To those congressmen, re-election was far more important than military preparedness. During the 1920s, the Army had little money for training, and when it did train, it used increasingly obsolescent equipment. Soldiers on isolated bases had little to do but await the good graces of their sergeant, granting them a pass into town where they could divest themselves at their Army pay. For officers, the pay was a little better. Active duty officers of the Army and Navy during the 1920s were nearly all graduates of the respective academies at West Point and Annapolis. There were simply not enough jobs in the reduced services to provide berths for graduates of the Reserve Officers Training Corps. For the officers, social graces were as important as military skills. As a means of advancement, a young officer who earned the ire of a senior officer as spouse found his career in jeopardy. Officers were expected to attend formal cotillions and balls celebrating George Washington's birthday, Navy Day, Army Day, the President's inauguration, and other auspicious occasions. White gloves and dress swords accompanied their full-dress uniforms. Marrying well was a career move for many social climbers. For the Navy, some such formal events were held aboard capital ships. For the most part, the great battleships officers supported this lifestyle, with a pay scale that began at $176 per month, roughly $3,000 today. If one should reach the lofty rank of Colonel Army or Captain Navy, one received more than 3 times that amount. It was needed not only to maintain the extensive uniform requirements of the services, but also to pay mess bills. Both the Army and the Navy required their officers to pay for their food with monthly Checks made out to their mess treasurer, although memberships and officers' clubs were not required. The social nature of the services made it necessary, and it to cost money even aboard ship. The officers of the Navy and Marines paid for their food, while the enlisted men enjoyed the largesse of Uncle Sam when taking their meals. The lessons of the Great War were applied only reluctantly. The lessons of the Great War were applied only reluctantly following the war then known globally as the Great War. Some younger officers in the American services recognized the need to modernize submarines. Airplanes and armored vehicles had all become effective weapons of war. The need to equip the U.S. Army and Navy with modern weapons and develop the tactics to use them in war was recognized by some officers, though for the most part more senior officers disagreed. So did Congress, at least as pertains to the Army American public. Sentiment tilted towards isolationism during the 1920s. The Army's role was seen as defensive, as it was unlikely it would be deployed in foreign conflicts ever again. The Navy was viewed as a defensive measure, the first line of national defense, without the need for long-range, high-endurance submarines. Congress annually spent more on the Navy than the Army, both for procurements and operations officers from both services who argued for modernized defensive weapons, and tactics were viewed by their seniors as troublesome mavericks. Among them were the Army's George Patton, who pushed hard for the development of armored divisions. And warfare, Billy Mitchell developed the Army Air Services and the enmity of the U.S. Navy by demonstrating Army Air Service bombers could sink battleships. The Navy pointed out the results would be different if the battleship was shooting back. Nonetheless, other naval officers, led by Captain William Moffett, began to lobby for a naval air service, including aircraft carriers. Mavericks in both services encountered opposition from senior military leadership and the money dealers in Congress, yet for the most part their views were eventually vindicated during the 1920s. However, the weapons they pushed for were slow in coming. World events in the 1930s proved the accuracy of their views. The Navy's best sailors were allowed to volunteer for submarines. The Navy's best sailors were allowed to volunteer for submarines during World War I. The U.S. Navy viewed the submarine as a chiefly defensive weapon with limited range and seagoing endurance. Beginning in 1920 and through 1925, the Navy commissioned 51 submarines, designated as S-boats unnamed, and assigned numbers such as S1, S2, and so on. The boats were the first of the U.S. Navy designed for long-range patrols. The men who crewed them were all volunteers, some of whom were inspired by the fact that submariners earned more money. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt experienced a dive on the submarine USS Plunger. Following his dive, the president directed officers and enlisted men in submarines receive hazardous duty pay in addition to their regular compensation. Until then, the Navy considered submarine duty as equivalent to shore duty, and the men aboard submarines received less money than their counterparts in surface ships. The extra pay attracted volunteers to the submarine service and the NURES. Boats offered more opportunities for sailors interested in the undersea service. In the 1920s, the senior naval hierarchy still did not consider submarines to be useful beyond scouting and commerce raiding, but the public came to view submarines with awe, especially after several accidents led to the loss of boats. Dramatic stories of sailors tapping out Morse code messages to communicate with their would-be rescuers. On one occasion, the loss of for in 1927 reinforced the public belief in the hazardous nature of submarine sailors, and submarines earned a special cachet among the armed forces and in the public eye, becoming the elite of the U.S. Navy during the 1920s. The Army embarrassed itself over its transport capabilities in 1919 in an ill-advised effort to demonstrate to the public its long-distance transport capabilities. The U.S. Army organized a cross-country caravan. In 1919, they invited reporters from major national newspapers along for the ride. Over 80 vehicles, including trucks, ambulances, hankers, passenger cars. For the reporters, troop carriers, and field kitchens, as well as a pontoon boat, carried 250 for enlisted men and over a dozen officers. Among the officers was temporary Lieutenant Colonel Dwight David Eisenhower. Ike volunteered when the boredom of his posting at Fort Meade, Maryland, simply became too much to bear at Fort Meade. Eisenhower's chief duty later lamented was serving as a fourth when senior officers needed one for a game of bridge. The massive caravan thundered out of Washington, D.C. on July 7, 1919. I joined the train. In Frederick, Maryland, at the end of the first day, it had covered just 46 miles and encountered several breakdowns. The disastrous beginning was a harbinger for the rest of the ordeal before they reached the West Coast 62 days later. Several incidents required the aid of local authorities and civilians to help them on their way. On at least one occasion, stuck vehicles required horses to pull them out of the muck. Over the course of the Army's demonstration of its transport capabilities, it averaged just 52 miles per day. The Army touted the caravan as a triumph, blaming the slow pace on inadequate roads across the western plains and mountain passes. The reporters along for the ride focused on the many breakdowns of the vehicles. Some opined the Army could not reasonably expect adequate roads when transporting men and materials under combat conditions. The experience of transport inadequacy remained with Eisenhower for the rest of his life. In 1924, the U.S. Army attempted to fly around the world. In 1924, this Army attempted to fly around the world in part to gain public support and thus tax dollars for the expansion of the Army Air Service. In 1924, for pilots and for mechanics took off, and for airplanes from Seattle, Washington, they flew along the Aleutians, crossing the Pacific to the Soviet Union and down over Japan to Southeast Asia. From there they proceeded across India, Iraq, and into Europe. When they came to the Atlantic, the Navy cooperated with a string of ships patrolling the area, over which they would fly standing by for rescue if needed. They landed at both ice land in Greenland in less than desirable conditions, from Greenland to Labrador and then Nova Scotia. The flight continued, though breakdowns and other issues led to only one of the aircraft actually completing the entire circumnavigation, which ended in Seattle on September 28, 1924. As they crossed the United States, several stops brought out enthusiastic crowds. The 175-day journey succeeded in gaining public acclaim for the Army Air Service, though that acclaim did not lead to a significant increase in congressional support dollars for development, and expansion remained difficult to come by. The circumnavigation by air became one of several aviation achievements of the 1920s, which led to the widespread belief in American technological superiority, yet funding for military aviation in both the Navy and the Army continued to meet resistance in the penurious Congress during the 1920s. Shoestring budgets and competition between the services meant the aviation branches grew slowly, though they did grow. For the Navy, aviation was seen as primarily a scouting service. The Army was beginning to develop the possibilities as an offensive strike weapon. Both services looked away over violations of the Volstead Act. The 1920s, and Prohibition meant that servicemen in the United States, as well as its territories, were forbidden to drink alcoholic beverages like their civilian counterparts. Many servicemen simply ignored the law. Dwight Eisenhower, a future president of the United States, made bathtub gin in his quarters at Fort Meade, Maryland. George Patton brewed his own beer. Omar Bradley, for much of his life, was a teetotaler and had his first taste of whiskey in Hawaii. During Prohibition, it was the beginning of a habit of having one or two drinks every night before dinner, which he continued for the rest of his life. Though there were exceptions, of course, most commanders ignored their men returning from nights off drunk as long as they did not report for duty, while impaired. Even the Army's Chief of Staff, John J. Pershing, enjoyed evening drinks with his George C. Marshall. Alcohol had been banned on U.S. Navy ships since 1914 and Prohibition removed it from naval bases and shore facilities. Sailors found ways to circumvent the law. When ashore overseas, they found alcohol easily, and though official procedure was to warn them against drinking once again, most officers ignored the ban. During the years 1926 to 1930, to the Army averaged 89 convictions by courts-martial for drunkenness per year. The Navy averaged even fewer. The Army also noted a distinct preference of officers applying for overseas service. The Philippines and Tianjin, China, where the United States maintained a garrison, were requested postings by 80% of officers. Both offered legal alcohol, though in many circumstances officers were forced to accept a reduction in rank to serve. In those posts in the 1920s, promotion was slow, and such an acceptance speaks volumes regarding life in the military. The Army was segregated. The Navy slightly less so. The Army was segregated. The Navy slightly less so. During World War I, black sailors served in Navy ships, usually as firemen or coalers, or as messette. And in serving officers in the ward rooms after World War I ended enlistments for black. Americans in the naval service were discontinued. However, black sailors already in the service were allowed to remain, received promotions, and many reached the rank of non-commissioned officers. Most, if not all, served in shore assignments, and were allowed to remain in the service until retirement with the same pay and promotion. Opportunities as white sailors serving in the same specialties in 1930 to black Americans were again allowed to serve aboard ships as mess stewards and attendants only, as on any ship they were assigned collateral duties for specific situations such as battle stations. By the end of the 1930s, approximately 4,000 black sailors served in the U.S. Navy Army units were entirely segregated both during the First World War and in the interwar years. Black soldiers messed separately, were assigned separate barracks, and those trained in integrated classrooms were mostly isolated from their white counterparts. Black officers served only in black regiments. The number of enlisted black soldiers dropped steadily through the 1920s during World War I. Draft boards, particularly in the Deep South, drafted a disproportionate number of blacks into the segregated regiments. Following the war, enlistment of black soldiers was discouraged. The Army's official view regarding black soldiers was reflected in a 1925 report written by a clearly racist white officer, Major Brahan. Somerville wrote of American blacks and the use of Negro manpower in war compared to the white man. He is admittedly of inferior mentality. He is inherently weak in character. Sailors in the U.S. Coast Guard were busy throughout the 1920s. Sailors in the U.S. Coast Guard were busy throughout the 1920s during World War I. The Coast Guard was temporarily transferred to the Navy Department after the war. The service returned to the Department of the Treasury. It has then peacetime home the Volstead Act, which provided the enforcement authority for prohibition, assigned that role to Treasury, which was why Elliotness and the Untouchables were called team men sailors in the U.S. Coast Guard spent the 1920s hard at work often at sea and on the Great Lakes chasing and capturing smugglers of alcoholic beverages. When the 1920s began, the Coast Guard consisted of about 4,000 officers and men. During the decade, the service grew to over 10,000. It was the only branch of the U.S. Armed Forces to expand during the 1920s. It acquired new ships, postal cutters, and mothballed Navy destroyers. To aid in the accomplishment of its mission in 1925, the Coast Guard acquired its first airplanes, having convinced the Treasury Department that aerial searches greatly enhanced their ability to intercept smugglers, while the other services, particularly the U.S. Army, lost capabilities during the 1920s primarily because of steadily shrinking budgets. The Coast Guard became a highly effective, well-trained interdiction force. It even gained combat experience in running gun battles with some smugglers when smugglers adopted coded radio transmissions to communicate. The Coast Guard countered with an increasingly sophisticated signals intelligence group adept at cracking complex codes. Repeal of Prohibition brought a drawdown for the service, including the loss of the destroyers. But during the 1920s, life in the Coast Guard was a busy, dangerous, and exciting career. By 1930, it was arguably the best trained of all the American armed forces. The Army took on non-military roles in the 1920s. In 1930s, the Army took on non-military roles in the 1920s and 1930s. For troops stationed in the United States, a series of non-military duties occupied their time. During the interwar years, the Army became a relief force in the face of natural disasters, setting up emergency camps and feeding those whose lives were disrupted. In 1934, as a result of a scandal affecting airmail contracts with private carriers, President Roosevelt abruptly canceled all contracts. He assigned the U.S. Army Air Corps to deliver all air mail. In an executive order, FDR ordered the Army to deliver all air mail under the authority of the Postmaster General and in accordance with his schedules. Included a great deal of night flying, though prepared and with limited equipment such as suitable airplanes for the mission. The Army began delivering airmail in February 1934. The Army lacked the necessarily experienced pilots and possessed only airplanes unsuited to the task prior to 1930 for budget coup. These severely hampered pilot training in the U.S. Army Air Corps. Flying was for the most part only in clear weather, only in daylight in an open cockpit aircraft. The private contractors delivering the mail used to establish their routes in civilian passenger airliners. The Army pilots were unfamiliar with the routes and had no such aircraft. The Army initially selected 48 pilots to carry the mail, none of them from their most experienced ranks. In fact, only 2 of the pilots had more than 50 hours of experience flying on instruments, and only 31 had over 50 hours of flying at night. By March 9, after just 19 days of the Army carrying the mail, 10 pilots and navigators observers had been killed in crashes from flying in inclement weather. FDR publicly humiliated ordered Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur to suspend the project on March 11. The airmail debacle revealed the inadequacies of the U.S. Army Air Corps. In the 1930s, the airmail debacle revealed the inadequacies of the U.S. Army Air Corps in the 1930s. As the Army resumed carrying the airmail on March 19 using severely limited routes and operating only in clear weather, eventually over 260 Army pilots participated in the program. Among them, Curtis LeMay and Ira Ecker. Air mail service was gradually returned to contracted carriers, and the Army's participation ended in May. In the aftermath, Speaker of the House Henry Rainey commented on the Air Corps: "If it is not equal to carrying the mail, I would like to know what it would do in carrying bombs." The Chief of the Army Air Corps, Major General Benjamin Felloy, resigned and retired, and following a lengthy investigation by a congressional committee, receiver reprimand, and public humiliation, Chief of Staff MacArthur managed to keep his own skirts clean despite the obvious training defects within a portion of the Army under his ultimate command. A board of inquiry under former Secretary of War Newton Baker investigated the conditions within the Army Air Corps. 9 of its 12 members were Army Ground Forces officers. The board rejected the need to expand the Air Corps or granted authority of an autonomous service. It recommended improved training, particularly in instrument flying, though it had no means of expanding the budget to pay for it. The Air Corps continued to operate under the authority of the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. Through his assigned Chief of the Army Air Corps the following year, Germany revealed to the world its modernized Luftwaffe, a violation of the Versailles Treaty, but an accomplished fact. The Army Air Corps moved quickly to obtain modern aircraft and improve pilot training as much as military budgets allowed. Douglas MacArthur became Chief of Staff in November 1930. Douglas MacArthur became Chief of Staff in November 1930. When Douglas MacArthur became Chief of Staff following stints as superintendent at West Point and command in the troubled Philippines. His credentials as a prima donna were already well known within the Army at his desk in the war department. MacArthur preferred to wear a Japanese kimono rather than his uniform. During the 1930s, most officers working in the various bureaucracies in Washington wore civilian clothes to work, but not many wore Japanese garb. MacArthur used a jeweled cigarette holder, maintained a mistress he had met when she was a teenager, 16, in the Philippines, and established a public relations staff to control his image in the press. He considered the British Empire to be a threat to the United States, especially in the Pacific. MacArthur negotiated with the Navy to ensure the defense of shore installations was in the hands of his army. By 1931, the general habitually referred to himself in the third person in correspondence and in meetings. He resisted cuts to the Army's budget during the Depression, gaining enemies within the White House and the War Department civilian employees. He also opposed the use of Army personnel for what he viewed as non-military employments. The Army supported many of the New Deal programs in a variety of ways, especially the Corps of Engineers. MacArthur jealously guarded against encroachments on his authority over the Army. He also warred with the press over reporting some misguided actions, including suing to reporters in 1932 when they threatened to call his young mistress to court as a material witness. The general dropped his suit and paid the reporters a settlement for their trouble, the interwar. Army helped create the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1933. The interwar Army helped create the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1933. FDR established the Civilian Conservation Corps to provide employment, job training, and physical conditioning for young men. In return, the CCC planted millions of trees, built roads, parks,
campgrounds, bridges, and other contributions to American infrastructure, reasoning that no American organization had more experience building and maintaining camps housing young men than the U.S. Army. FDR assigned them that role. Camps were established and commanded by reserve officers, and contingents of active duty troops supported them. MacArthur opposed the use of the Army in such a role, arguing it detracted from readiness. Most career Army officers took their cue from their Chief of Staff. In contrast, General George C. Marshall, who was eventually responsible for 35 CCC camps in the American Northwest, supported the program. Marshall later called his involvement with the CCC the most instructive service I ever had and the most interesting. When the CCC became the most popular, all of the New Deal's many initiatives, MacArthur characteristically took credit for its success. At its height, more than 2,500 camps were in operation, providing leadership and management training for reserve and active duty Army officers across the nation, training which would otherwise have been unavailable due to restrictive military budgets. During the Depression, the Army's Quartermaster Corps supplied the camps with everything from food to toothbrushes, sports equipment, motion pictures, and in the camps established for older veterans of the First World War, canteens which included beer. Eventually, MacArthur lobbied for an increase in Army control of the camps, including a voice in the work to be accomplished by the men nominally approved by the U.S. Forest Service. Soldiers attached to the CCC camps had better training, better food, and higher morale than their counterparts on sleepy American bases.